Darius King knows how to keep his cool. He's spent years facing down prejudice as a black police officer. But when he arrives in the small, insular town of Willow Springs to take over as police chief, he's met with more than just skepticism. Two local officers stop him on a deserted highway his first night in town, harassing him without realizing who he is. By morning, they'll face him as their new boss. Yet for Darius, this isn't just a job. His younger brother Ezra, also a cop, died years ago under suspicious circumstances in another small town. Now, Darius is determined to uncover the truth behind the corrupt systems that silenced his brother and that still hold power over Willow Springs. With his own life and career on the line, Darius will have to expose the powerful few hiding behind the badge and finally confront the secrets that cost Ezra his life. In a town where justice is just a word, Darius is about to redefine what it means to wear the badge. Darius King gripped the wheel, his eyes narrowing at the endless dark ribbon of highway ahead. The steady hum of the engine was his only companion, the world around him quiet but for the occasional sway of trees under the night sky. He was alone, just him, the road, and a thick blanket of thoughts that crowded his mind. He glanced at the photograph clipped to his dashboard. A young man with a bright smile and a twinkle in his eye. Ezra. Almost there, little brother, Darius muttered. Almost. Ezra had died under mysterious circumstances, labeled an accident by those in power, but Darius had always sensed more. The promise of this new role in Willow Springs was his chance to seek the truth and honor his brother's legacy. His position as the new police chief wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Lost in thought, Darius barely noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror until they were right on top of him. 2 patrol cars. He sighed, signaling to pull over. His fingers clenched the wheel, memories from his past with similar situations flashing in his mind. A tall, bulky officer with a shaved head sauntered up to Darius's window, tapping on the glass. Darius rolled it down, meeting the man's sneer with a steady gaze. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone more dismissive than polite. Here you go, officer, Darius said, handing over his documents. He noticed the name tag. Brant. What brings you through these parts, Mr. King? Brant asked, glancing back at his partner, who had stationed himself behind the car, lazily inspecting the taillights. Work, Darius replied simply, watching Brant's smirk grow. Work? Huh. Brant chuckled, glancing over the car. In a car like this? Looks like you've hit a lucky streak. Darius resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He kept his tone neutral. Just passing through, officer. Brant and his partner exchanged a glance. Then Brant leaned in, his sneer sharper. Well, let's have some fun with this. Step out of the vehicle, Mr. King. Darius's jaw tightened, but he complied, moving slowly. Brant's partner, Officer McCann, approached, looking Darius up and down with a mocking grin. McCann held up an apple, grinning. Go on, put this on your head, he said, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Darius hesitated, his muscles tensing with every ounce of indignation. But he didn't flinch, didn't let them see the anger that boiled under his calm exterior. With careful movements, he placed the apple on his head, meeting Brant's gaze with quiet defiance. This was a game to them, a small-town power play, but Darius knew he'd be seeing them again soon. And next time, the rules would be different. Brant walked in a slow circle around Darius, as if inspecting prey. His hand hovered near his holster, a smug smile etched on his face. Tell me, Mr. King, he began, tone dripping with mock politeness, what kind of work are you in? We're not used to seeing visitors like you here. McCann snorted. Maybe he's here to join the circus, he muttered under his breath. Darius's gaze remained steady. I'm starting a new job here in Willow Springs, he replied, keeping his tone measured. Oh, yeah, Brant said, raising an eyebrow. And what kind of job is that? Darius didn't answer right away. He glanced at the apple he was still holding, then back at Brant. Let's just say I'll be making sure everyone in this town is treated fairly. Brant's smile faltered for a split second, and Darius caught it. But Brant recovered, rolling his eyes and motioning dismissively. Get back in your car, Mr. King. "You're free to go." Darius returned to his car, his heart pounding with both anger and anticipation. Tomorrow, he'd walk into the Willow Springs Police Department, and he'd remember this moment well. The morning light poured over the Willow Springs Police Department, casting long shadows across the brick building. Darius adjusted his uniform and took a deep breath before stepping inside. He scanned the space, noting the tightly packed desks, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the eyes that slowly turned toward him. A young officer with sandy hair and a nervous smile approached. "Captain Williams," he stammered. "That's me," Darius confirmed, his tone calm but authoritative. The officer nodded, clearly flustered. "Everyone's waiting for you in the briefing room." Darius walked through the station, noting the whispers and wary glances that followed him. He entered the room to find a handful of officers, including Brandt and McCann, seated in the back with barely concealed shock on their faces. Darius smiled inwardly, but maintained a neutral expression. "Good morning," he greeted the room, his voice carrying authority. "I'm Captain Williams, and I'll be overseeing this department. I expect professionalism, respect, and integrity from every one of you. We're here to serve the people of Willow Springs, and that's exactly what we'll do." Brandt raised his hand, his expression skeptical. "Respectfully, Captain, we've been doing fine without changes." Darius met his gaze without flinching. "Sometimes change is exactly what's needed." Brandt and McCann exchanged a look, and Darius noted the simmering defiance. It wasn't just Brandt and McCann he'd be facing. He'd have to contend with an entire department used to its own set of rules. After the briefing, Darius retreated to his office, a small room with a clear view of the front desk. He sat down, observing the interactions in the squad room. Moments later, there was a knock at his door. "Come in," Darius called. The door opened, and a young woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail stepped in. She held herself with a quiet confidence that immediately impressed him. "Captain Williams, I'm Officer Sanders," she said, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you, Officer Sanders," Darius replied, shaking her hand. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the closed door. "I just wanted to say, it's good to have someone like you here. I think we could use some change." Darius nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I have a feeling I'll need a few allies, Sanders. Count me in," she replied firmly. Another knock sounded, and this time an older man with graying hair and a reserved expression entered. Lieutenant Harris had a quiet, observant demeanor, and Darius sensed that he was someone who understood the unspoken dynamics of the department. "Captain," Harris said with a nod. "Welcome to Willow Springs." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Darius replied, meeting his gaze. Harris cleared his throat, casting a glance back at Sanders before speaking. "This department, it's got its own way of running things. Brandt and McCann, they have some influence." Darius's jaw clenched. "I gathered as much." Harris nodded, his expression almost apologetic. "Just wanted you to be aware. They don't take well to outside ideas." "Understood," Darius replied, a determined glint in his eye. "I'm here to do what's right, Lieutenant." "That's not going to change." Harris looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Well, I hope you stick to it, Captain. I've seen good officers run out of town before." As Harris left, Darius took a moment to gather his thoughts. Change wasn't going to come easily here, but he was ready. Later that day, Darius decided to take a walk through the town center. Willow Springs was quaint, almost frozen in time, with its small diners, coffee shops, and family-owned businesses. But as he strolled through the town, he could feel the weight of suspicion on him. Locals paused, watching him from across the street, their eyes a mix of curiosity and something colder, something wary. Darius stopped in front of a diner and looked through the window. Inside, Brandt and McCann were seated at a table, their eyes narrowing when they noticed him. Brandt offered a mocking wave, and McCann smirked, leaning in to say something that made Brandt chuckle. Darius's eyes didn't waver, his expression unreadable as he met Brandt's gaze through the glass. He knew the battle was only beginning, and that his mere presence here was already unsettling the established order. As he turned and continued down the street, he felt a renewed resolve. This town, with its secrets and whispers, would know him soon enough, and he'd make sure they knew what he stood for. Darius walked into the briefing room the next morning with a purposeful stride. A dozen officers were assembled, some whispering among themselves, others stealing quick glances at him. Brant and McCann leaned against the wall at the back, arms crossed, their eyes narrowed. "Good morning, everyone," Darius began, his voice steady. "As I mentioned yesterday, I expect professionalism and integrity from all of you. That means transparency in everything we do. We're here to serve the people of Willow Springs." Brant raised a hand, a mocking smirk on his face. "With all due respect, Captain, we're just a small town department. Haven't had issues before, so why fix what's not broken?" Darius held his gaze. "Just because you haven't seen the issues doesn't mean they aren't there, Officer Brant." The room grew silent, tension hanging in the air. Darius took a steadying breath and continued. "We're going to be reevaluating some of our procedures, especially concerning civilian complaints. Every complaint will be addressed, and every file will be open for review." He noticed Officer Sanders sitting forward in her chair, her face set in a look of quiet support, while others shifted uncomfortably. Darius knew this was only the beginning. "All right, that's it for today," he said, dismissing them. As the officers filed out, he caught sight of Brant muttering to McCann, both of them shooting him looks that told him they weren't going to back down easily. The meeting left a clear impression. He had a department to win over or root out. Back in his office, Darius settled in to review the department's records. He opened a series of files on civilian complaints, many of which had been labeled resolved without any real documentation of an investigation. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, shaking his head. Darius jotted down notes, quickly noticing a pattern. Brant's name appeared in several cases that had been dismissed without investigation. There was a vague, troubling consistency to it, as though complaints were smoothed over, swept under the rug by someone intent on maintaining a particular image. The sound of a knock broke his concentration. Looking up, he saw Officer Sanders standing in the doorway, her face tentative. "Come on in, Sanders," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat down, glancing at the files on his desk. "You're already knee-deep in paperwork, I see." "More than I expected," Darius replied. "You've been here for a while. Any thoughts on how things are handled around here?" Sanders hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There's a rhythm to this place. If you go along with it, life is easier. But if you push against it," she trailed off, giving him a pointed look. Darius nodded, understanding her unspoken words. "Thanks for being honest, Sanders. I appreciate it." She gave a slight smile. "I figured you'd rather hear the truth, Captain." After she left, Darius made a note to keep a closer eye on Brant's records. The pattern was clear. Now he just needed proof. That afternoon, Darius drove to the town cemetery. He parked under a large oak tree and made his way through the rows of headstones, finally stopping at Ezra's grave. "Hey, easy," he murmured, looking down at the simple stone with his brother's name etched across it. He crouched down, resting a hand on the cold surface. "I'm here now, doing what I promised. I'll find out what happened." Darius sat in silence for a long moment, letting the memories wash over him. He remembered Ezra's fierce integrity, his drive to right every wrong, and the whispered stories about his last days, about how he'd been working on something important, something dangerous. As he stood, Darius felt his resolve harden. "I'll do it for you, little brother. I'll make sure the truth comes out." He walked back to his car with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever Willow Springs threw his way. Back at the station, Darius sought out Lieutenant Harris, who was sitting at his desk, filling out paperwork. When Darius approached, Harris gave a polite nod, his face cautious. "Lieutenant, got a minute?" Darius asked, motioning toward his office. Harris followed him in, taking a seat as Darius shut the door. "I need some insight, Harris, particularly on Brant and McCann." Harris glanced at the closed door, then lowered his voice. "They're complicated. They've been here a long time, and they've built a lot of influence. Brant's got connections. Folks in town, some with deep pockets, seem to like him." Darius leaned forward. "And what about their work here?" "I've seen some patterns that concern me." Harris sighed, his fingers drumming on the arm of the chair. Captain, there's a group in the department. It's unofficial, but they have each other's backs, especially when it comes to shutting down anything that could shake things up. Are you telling me Brant's got a network here? Darius asked, his voice low. Harris nodded, his gaze steady. They keep each other protected. If you're planning to take him on, you're up against more than just him and McCann. Darius felt a simmering anger, but kept his tone even. Thanks, Lieutenant. That's what I needed to know. As Harris left, Darius leaned back in his chair. He wasn't just dealing with two rogue officers. He was up against a whole structure designed to maintain the status quo. Later that evening, Darius observed the station as officers clocked out. He noticed Brant and McCann in a corner of the squad room, casually talking to a group of junior officers. There was a camaraderie there, a sense of solidarity, but also something darker, like an unspoken code being reinforced. One of the junior officers, a young man named Blake, nodded as Brant clapped him on the shoulder. Darius couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the smirks and the ease with which Brant and McCann held court. Feeling a presence behind him, Darius turned to find Officer Sanders watching the scene as well. They've got their own crew, she murmured. And they keep it tight. Darius nodded. Seems like it. But that just means we'll have to keep ours tighter. Sanders looked at him, her eyes a mix of admiration and caution. You really mean to go up against them, don't you? I didn't come here to look the other way, Sanders, he replied. If we let this go, nothing changes. Sanders gave a slow nod. Well, Captain, for what it's worth, you've got at least one person who's with you. Darius smiled, appreciating her loyalty. That means more than you know. As he left the station, Darius felt the weight of what lay ahead. Brant and McCann's reach was deeper than he had realized, and the department was more divided than he'd hoped. But his mission was clear, to change Willow Springs for the better, no matter what resistance he faced. Darius leaned over a file, eyes narrowing as he read through yet another dismissed complaint against Brant. This one, dated only a few months ago, detailed an alleged use of excessive force during a traffic stop. The complaint had been marked resolved, with no indication of further investigation. The pattern was unmistakable. A soft knock sounded at his door, and Sanders entered, her face tense. Captain, there's a civilian here to see you. She's got a complaint against Brant. Darius looked up. Send her in. A middle-aged woman with wary eyes and clenched fists entered, her voice trembling as she recounted an incident where Brant had pulled her over, berated her for no reason, and accused her of loitering on a public road. As she spoke, Darius could see the strain in her face, the desperation to be heard and believed. I tried reporting it before, she said, her voice breaking, but no one did anything. They just ignored me. Darius's jaw tightened. Thank you for coming forward, he said, his tone firm but reassuring. This time, it won't be ignored. As she left, Darius felt the simmering anger rise. Brant's unchecked behavior, hidden behind layers of protection, had gone on long enough. With a renewed sense of urgency, Darius moved to confront him. Darius decided to go on a ride-along with Sanders that afternoon to see firsthand what was happening in the field. As they drove through the outskirts of town, they spotted Brant and McCann by the roadside, surrounding a young man whose hands were raised, his face twisted in fear. Let's stop here, Darius said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sanders parked the car, and they approached the scene. Darius noticed Brant's harsh grip on the young man's arm, McCann smirking nearby. Brant's eyes narrowed as Darius arrived. Problem here, officers? Darius asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Brant's grip on the young man's arm tightened momentarily before he released it, a mocking smile on his face. Just handling business, Captain. This guy was loitering. The young man shook his head quickly. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just waiting for my friend. Darius looked between Brant and McCann. Last I checked, waiting for a friend wasn't against the law. You're dismissed from this scene, officers. Sanders and I will take it from here. Brant's face hardened, but he didn't argue. Sure, Captain. Just thought we'd save you some time, he sneered, throwing a look at McCann as they walked back to their cruiser. Darius turned to the young man. You're free to go. I'm sorry for the trouble. The man nodded, visibly relieved, and left quickly. Darius watched Brant and McCann's cruiser disappear down the road, feeling the weight of their defiance. It was becoming clear that their actions weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger, darker pattern. After returning to the station, Darius went straight to his office, determined to dig deeper into his brother's files. He opened Ezra's case reports from his last days on the force and noticed similarities: complaints that had been dismissed without reason, incidents that had gone uninvestigated. It was as though Ezra had stumbled upon something much larger, something others wanted to stay hidden. One file, however, caught his eye. A report Ezra had marked as pending investigation, referring to the exact sort of intimidation tactics Darius had seen Brant and McCann use. Ezra had named a suspect in the cover-up, but the file ended abruptly, with no resolution or follow-up. Darius's heart pounded as he realized his brother had been circling the same people, the same tactics, the same darkness he now faced in Willow Springs. A quiet knock on his door startled him. Sanders entered, her face apprehensive. "Captain, you look like you've seen a ghost," she observed. Darius met her gaze, a heaviness in his voice. "I think my brother was onto something here. Something big. These tactics, these cover-ups, they're not new. I believe Ezra was investigating the same kind of corruption we're dealing with now." Sanders looked down, her expression tense. "Then we need to keep going, Captain. For him." Darius nodded, the pieces slowly coming together in his mind. He was no longer just an outsider. He was walking the same path his brother had once walked, a path that led to the truth, but also to danger. Late that night, Darius called a meeting with Sanders and Lieutenant Harris in his office, closing the blinds and lowering his voice. "I found something in Ezra's files," he began, watching Harris's reaction closely. "My brother was investigating a cover-up that sounds disturbingly familiar. I believe Brant and McCann were part of the same system that may have cost Ezra his life." Harris's face paled. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Captain, you're talking about a society, an unspoken alliance within the department. They protect each other, cover for each other. It's been that way for years. Were you ever involved?" Darius asked, his tone sharp but calm. Harris swallowed, his gaze dropping. "I knew about it, yes, but I never participated. I thought if I stayed out of it, I'd avoid trouble. But seeing what it's done, I can't stay silent anymore." Sanders spoke up, her voice strong. "Then let's do something about it. We can't just keep looking the other way." Darius nodded. "We need to be strategic. If we make the wrong move, they'll close ranks, and we'll lose any chance of exposing them. For now, we gather evidence. We get everything we can, proof of every cover-up, every abuse. We bring in outside oversight if we have to." Harris nodded, though he looked nervous. "I'll help however I can, Captain. I owe it to you, and to Ezra." As they dispersed, Darius felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. They were moving forward, yes, but he knew Brant and McCann wouldn't let this challenge go unanswered. The following evening, Darius was locking up the station when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Brant standing there, his expression dark, McCann just a step behind him. "Evening, Captain," Brant drawled, his voice dripping with mock respect. "Evening, officers," Darius replied, keeping his tone steady. Brant stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You're stirring up things that don't need stirring, Captain. It'd be best if you backed off." Darius held his ground, meeting Brant's glare with unwavering resolve. "I'm here to do my job, Brant. That means protecting the people in this town, whether they're civilians or not." Brant's eyes narrowed. "This town doesn't need an outsider telling us how to run things." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Maybe what it needs is exactly that." The tension between them was palpable. McCann took a step forward, his smirk gone, replaced by a steely gaze. "Be careful, Captain. Accidents happen around here." Darius felt the threat hang heavy in the air, but he didn't flinch. "Is that so?" he replied, his voice cold. "Then let me be clear. I don't scare easily." Brant's face darkened. "We'll see about that." Without another word, Brant and McCann turned and walked away, leaving Darius alone in the dimly lit parking lot. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the danger pressing down on him, but he wasn't about to let them win. He was in this for the long haul, and he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Darius sat at his desk, the weight of the morning's decision settling over him. He had officially requested an independent review of the department, bringing in a team of outside observers. The request was formal, strategic, and, he knew, a declaration of war against the system that had protected Brandt and McCann for so long. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Harris, his expression conflicted. "You really went through with it," Harris said, taking a seat. "An independent review? Brandt and McCann aren't going to take that lightly, Captain." "I'm not here to cater to their comfort," Darius replied firmly. "I'm here to find justice, for Ezra, for everyone they've mistreated. This department needs accountability." Harris nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "Well, you've got a few of us backing you. Just watch your back." As Harris left, Darius glanced out the window, catching sight of Brandt's patrol car pulling into the lot. He knew Brandt would soon realize the implications of the review. The battle lines were drawn, and the air was thick with tension. By afternoon, the atmosphere in the station was strained. Officers who had once laughed together were now whispering in small groups, eyeing each other with suspicion. Some looked to Darius with newfound respect. Others watched him with barely concealed disdain. As Darius walked through the squad room, he caught a glimpse of Brandt and McCann, huddled with a few other officers. Their whispers stopped as he approached, and Brandt's gaze was icy. "You've really stirred things up, Captain," Brandt said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Darius met his eyes calmly. "Doing the right thing often does." Brandt let out a low chuckle. "Right. And dragging the whole department through the mud. That's your idea of, right?" Darius didn't flinch. "If there's no mud to find, then there's nothing to worry about, is there?" Brandt's smirk faltered, and McCann muttered something under his breath, casting a dark glance at Darius. The silent message was clear. Darius was pushing his limits, and they would push back. As Darius moved away, he spotted Sanders across the room. She gave him a subtle nod, an unspoken message of solidarity. The lines were drawn, and it was clear who stood where. That evening, after most officers had left, Darius returned to his office only to find his papers scattered across the desk, files open and overturned. Some of the pages, particularly notes on Ezra's case, were crumpled, and several were missing. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise. This was no accident. It was sabotage. A sound in the hallway made him turn. Sanders appeared, her eyes widening as she took in the mess. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice a mix of shock and anger. "Looks like someone wanted to make a point," Darius replied, attempting to gather the files, frustration seeping into his voice. Sanders moved to help, her face set in determination. "They're getting desperate, Captain. That means we're close to something big." Darius nodded. "We are. But they know it too. And they're not going to stop at this." As they worked to organize the remaining files, Darius felt a renewed resolve. The intimidation tactics, the attempts to sabotage, they were only proof that he was hitting nerves. But he wouldn't let them silence him, not now. The next morning, Darius was summoned to the mayor's office. The room was imposing, with dark wood furniture and large windows that let in streams of sunlight. The mayor, a middle-aged man with a carefully composed expression, motioned for Darius to sit. "Captain Williams, thank you for coming in," the mayor began, his tone polite but cool. "I hear you've requested an independent review of the police department. That's quite a drastic step." Darius met his gaze evenly. "It's a necessary step, Mayor. The department has unresolved complaints, uninvestigated incidents. This review is about accountability." The mayor sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You know, Willow Springs is a traditional town. People here value stability, a sense of order. Your changes, while well-intentioned, are causing a lot of unrest." Darius remained silent, letting the mayor's words sink in. He could feel the underlying message. Stop pushing, or face the consequences. "I understand that, sir," Darius replied, his tone measured. "But justice doesn't compromise for tradition. If there's been misconduct, the people here deserve to know." The mayor's expression tightened. "Just be careful, Captain. Not everyone in this town appreciates having their lives disrupted." Darius left the office with the warning ringing in his ears. The town's power players were beginning to stir, uneasy with the changes he was pushing. But he was undeterred. He was here for justice, and no polite threat would sway him from that mission. That night, Darius sat alone in his hotel room, the dim light casting shadows across the scattered notes on his bed. Ezra's face stared back at him from a faded photograph, his brother's determined gaze a reminder of the purpose driving him forward. He picked up the photo, tracing the edges with his thumb. "I'm getting closer, Ezra. I can feel it," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "They tried to silence you, but they won't do the same to me." The weight of the day's events pressed down on him. The sabotage, the division in the department, the thinly veiled threat from the mayor. They all pointed to the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. And yet, those actions only strengthened his resolve. As he looked over the remaining notes on Ezra's case, Darius felt a new wave of determination wash over him. He would find the truth. For Ezra, for Willow Springs, and for every officer who had ever stood up against the wrongs in the system. The night stretched on, but for Darius, the path forward was clearer than ever. Darius sat in his office late into the evening, studying files under the dim light of his desk lamp. He was jolted from his thoughts by a knock at the door. Looking up, he saw Lieutenant Harris standing there, his face heavy with an expression Darius hadn't seen before. "Come in, Harris," Darius said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Harris closed the door behind him, glancing around as if making sure they were truly alone. "Captain, there's something I need to get off my chest," he began, his voice low. Darius leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I'm listening." Harris took a deep breath. "Years ago, I helped cover up some things. For Brandt and the others. It was never anything I agreed with. But you don't say no to them, not without consequences." Darius nodded, his gaze steady. "You're saying there's a network within the department, a society?" Harris swallowed, nodding. "It's more than a network. It's a culture. If you question them, if you step out of line, well, let's just say they make sure it doesn't end well for you." Darius's jaw tightened. "And Ezra?" Harris hesitated, then nodded again, his face shadowed with regret. "I think he was getting too close. Too close to something they couldn't risk him uncovering." Darius's eyes flashed with determination. "Thank you, Harris. I know that wasn't easy." Harris gave a small nod. "I'm with you, Captain. I should have spoken up a long time ago. I'll help however I can." As Harris left, Darius felt a new surge of resolve. The pieces were falling into place, and he was ready to take the next step. The next morning, Darius was reviewing notes when Sanders knocked and entered his office, her face pale and tense. She held an envelope in her hand, which she placed on his desk. "What's this?" Darius asked, looking at her with concern. "An anonymous threat," Sanders replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was slipped under my door last night." Darius opened the envelope and read the note. "Stay away from the captain, or you'll regret it." He looked up, his face darkening. "They're targeting you because you're helping me?" Sanders nodded, her hands clenched tightly together. "I'm not afraid, Captain, but they're clearly trying to scare us." Darius stood, his gaze fierce. "I won't let anything happen to you, Sanders. But from now on, I want you to be extra cautious. If they think this will stop us, they're wrong." Sanders squared her shoulders, her face resolute. "I'm with you, Captain, no matter what." Darius gave her a nod of respect, deeply appreciative of her loyalty. But he knew the threat was real. The society within the department was willing to go to any lengths to protect themselves. Later that day, Darius spotted McKen heading out to his car. Seizing the opportunity, he followed him outside and called out, "McCann, we need to talk." McCann turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. "What do you want, Captain?" Darius didn't waste time. "I want the truth about my brother, Ezra. I know you were involved." McCann's face twisted into a smirk. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your brother was just another cop who couldn't handle the pressure." Darius took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I've seen the files. I know about the society, the cover-ups. You may think you're untouchable, but that ends here." McCann's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "You don't know anything, Williams. This town doesn't need some outsider stirring up trouble." "I'm not here to stir up trouble," Darius replied coldly. "I'm here to clean up a department that's been corrupt for far too long." McCann's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Captain." Darius didn't back down. "The mistake was thinking that intimidation would keep me quiet. I'm going to get justice for Ezra and everyone else you've wronged." As he turned and walked away, Darius could feel McCann's glare burning into his back. The confrontation had made one thing clear. McCann and Brandt wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Darius called a private meeting with Sanders, Harris, and a few other officers he trusted. They gathered in the small conference room, tension thick in the air. Darius looked around at each of them. "I won't sugarcoat this. Brandt and McCann have a hold on this department, and they're part of a network that's willing to do whatever it takes to maintain control. If we're going to expose them, we need to be unified." Sanders nodded. "I'm with you, Captain. They've gotten away with too much for too long." Harris cleared his throat. "Count me in as well. This department needs change." One of the younger officers, Officer Blake, hesitated, then spoke up. "I've seen things too, Captain. Things that just didn't seem right. I want to help." Darius gave him a reassuring nod. "Your courage is appreciated, Blake. This won't be easy, but together, we can make a difference." As the meeting continued, they strategized, gathering names, details, and evidence that could dismantle the society's control. They were preparing for a battle, one that would reshape the department and, possibly, the entire town. Late that night, Darius returned to his hotel room, exhausted but driven. He sat at the small table, Ezra's photograph in his hands. The familiar face stared back at him, the image both comforting and painful. "We're getting closer, Ezra," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "They tried to silence you, but they won't do the same to me." Darius placed the photo down, gathering the scattered notes and files from the evening's meeting. His allies were few, and the stakes were high, but he knew this fight was worth it. It was no longer just about justice for Ezra. It was about setting things right in a department that had lost its way. The night was still, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. But as he looked at the evidence they'd collected, the names, the dates, the patterns, he felt a renewed strength. The battle lines were drawn, and he was ready. The morning sun was barely up as Darius assembled his team in the station. Harris and Sanders stood beside him, both wearing expressions of grim determination. The evidence Darius had gathered over the last few weeks was enough to secure a warrant, and today, they would finally confront Brandt on his own turf. "We've got the warrant," Darius announced, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what was about to happen. "Brandt's property is our target. This raid will be conducted by the book. No room for error." The officers, including Sanders, exchanged tense glances, understanding the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just a raid. It was a step toward dismantling the corruption that had held their department hostage. As they arrived at Brandt's residence, Darius took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. They approached the door, and with a nod, Darius gave the signal. The team moved in swiftly, breaking through the door and spreading out to search the premises. Minutes into the search, Sanders called out from a small room down the hall. "Captain, you need to see this." Darius joined her, his gaze falling on stacks of files, hidden away in a locked cabinet. They contained records of incidents swept under the rug, and among them was a file marked with a name he knew too well, Ezra King. His heart pounded as he opened the file, revealing details of an accident report, including internal communications that made it clear Brandt had been involved in suppressing the investigation. This was it, the proof he needed. Hours later, back at the station, Brandt was brought in, his hands cuffed, his expression twisted with fury. Darius watched him as he was led into the interrogation room, the man's arrogance barely dampened by the shackles. As Darius sat across from him, Brandt leaned forward, a smirk playing on his face. "You think this changes anything, Williams?" he sneered. "The town's on my side. You're just an outsider here." Darius didn't flinch. He placed the file on the table, flipping it open to the pages on Ezra's accident. He looked Brandt dead in the eyes. "Tell me, Brant, how did my brother die? Brant's smirk faltered, replaced by a shadow of something darker. Your brother. He didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. He was warned, just like you. But he wouldn't listen. So you killed him, Darius said, his voice deadly calm. Brant let out a low laugh. If you want to call it that, we call it survival. He was a problem, just like you're becoming. Darius's face hardened, and he leaned closer. Well, Brant, this problem isn't going anywhere. You'll pay for what you did to Ezra, and you'll answer for every other life you've destroyed. For the first time, Brant's confidence seemed to waver. The realization that his power was slipping away, that his crimes were now in the hands of the law, hit him like a punch to the gut. With Brant in custody, the independent review Darius had requested weeks ago was completed. The findings were devastating for the department, resulting in suspensions and criminal charges against multiple officers, including McCann, who had been part of Brant's society of influence. As the press descended on Willow Springs, the town's residents learned of the extent of the corruption that had plagued their police department. Darius felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing that his fight had finally brought justice to the people of Willow Springs and to his brother's memory. One by one, the officers loyal to Brant's twisted code fell, stripped of their badges, as Darius dismantled the organization that had corrupted the department from within. In the days that followed, the station became a quieter, more focused place, filled with officers dedicated to integrity. Darius stood at the front of the briefing room, his gaze sweeping over the officers who remained. Sanders and Harris sat at the front, symbols of the new leadership he intended to cultivate within the department. Today marks a new beginning, Darius said, his voice carrying the authority he had fought so hard to establish. From now on, this department will stand for accountability, for justice, and for the people of Willow Springs. I expect each of you to uphold those values. Sanders nodded, her face set with quiet pride, while Harris offered a respectful nod, his earlier doubts replaced with newfound respect. The other officers, some of whom had been skeptical at first, now looked at Darius with the respect he had earned through his actions. Darius continued, if any of you ever feel that something's wrong, or that someone is abusing their power, you come to me. We're going to build a department where every voice matters, where every officer can be proud to serve. The room was silent, filled with a sense of purpose and unity that hadn't existed before. Darius had done more than just expose corruption. He had rebuilt the foundation of the department, creating a legacy that would last. A few days later, Darius visited the cemetery, a small bouquet of flowers in hand. He found Ezra's grave and stood silently for a moment, looking down at the stone marker with his brother's name. Hey, Ezra, he said softly, kneeling beside the grave. It's done. I got them. I couldn't save you back then, but I made sure they won't hurt anyone else. He placed the flowers by the headstone, feeling a mixture of sadness and peace. The journey had been long, painful, but standing here, he knew he had kept his promise. He had brought justice not just for his brother, but for every person who had suffered at the hands of Brant's society. As he turned to leave, he noticed a few locals standing nearby, nodding respectfully as he walked past. Their quiet acknowledgement felt like an unspoken thank you, a sign that Willow Springs was beginning to change, one small step at a time. Darius walked back to his car, feeling a peace he hadn't known since Ezra's death. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the town. Willow Springs was still a place of traditions, but he had given it something new, hope for a future built on justice.